you were in the Trump White House and you saw what was going on in that White House. This is something that a lot of people speculate about, but they weren't there for. You were there in the early going. What was it like inside the Trump White House when you were there? What was the methodology? What was the thinking? What did you have to manage? Because you were the one that was communicating. I know he was communicating by Twitter a lot, but you were
Right.
communicating directly with the press. What was that like?
It was intense, some days unbelievably chaotic, and it was transformational, though. It was interesting. I approached the job, I think, in a very traditional sense. I said, "Oh, I've been around Washington. I've watched Dana Perino and Ari Fleischer and all these folks go before me, and I thought, okay, I know what the model is, if you will." And the problem is, I never really factored in initially that Trump wasn't the tradition. I mean, he definitely didn't run a traditional campaign, but I thought, okay, he'll fall into the traditional role. And so I built a team and an office and a structure that sort of assumed that we would have a traditional White House. We didn't. And so there was a lot of adapting and saying, okay, to your point, normally you didn't have a president or a principal that was leading on the communications front. They would look at their press person in all my years of doing this and say, okay, put something out on this or draft me up something. You were the one, traditionally the press person, to lead the communications effort. In the Trump White House, he led them. And that took some adapting and some getting used to. To get back to the atmosphere, it was at times personal, vitriolic, but it was unbelievably intense. I mean, I can't, you started off this thing with some very kind comments about, I think I lost 10 years of my life in those 6 months.
Well, I can well imagine. You had two jobs, actually.
I
You were
did.
communications director and press secretary, correct?
Correct.
How do you do both of those things? Because the communications director is a lot of forward planning, correct?
That's right. Yes. The communications director is the person who's thinking about tomorrow, next week, next month, saying, okay, how do we look at something with a whole of government approach and say, okay, how do we get the agencies, the departments, craft a message that we can execute? The press secretary lives in the day. And there's two different staffs. They work well and side by side. But you're right. It was sort of, and there's a variety of reasons that would take an entire podcast to go into. But, uh, you know, if I could have found somebody earlier, I would have. I did find a communications director probably the second or third month who stuck around for a little while. It was not helpful to have two roles. And it was one of the things that I look back on and say, and people had advised me against it. But again, there were reasons we did what we did at the time that made sense. It's just looking back on it, you go, having two roles at that level is never a good idea.
Yeah. Now, this was the first president that really took social media by storm and used it in a direct way. And you being communications director and press secretary, I'm guessing even though you were kind of all things communication, I'm guessing you didn't vet a lot of those tweets.
How about none? I don't think there was a single instance that I looked at one. There were a couple times where he said I might be doing X or something, but no, he tweet first and tell me later.
Did anybody?
Uh, Dan Scavino, who headed his social media team, sometimes was intimately involved. But I always said between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. you got the tweet that said, I am proud to support the da 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 da, and then after 5 and before 9 you got the so and so is a total jerk. Those were all him.
Did you ever counsel him about the name calling and derogating people's character? I mean, because he did character attacks, character
Yeah.
assassination, which, I've studied you all the way back to your college campus days.
Oh boy.
You've never taken that approach. You've never
No.
given that advice in a campaign to anybody. You've objected to it when people use that strategy with you.
Yeah.
What did you say to him about that sort of thing when he went after people calling him fat, ugly, dumb, moron, whatever he might say?
Yeah. I mean, first, it's just not how I was raised, right? This is, I think, it's a sense of value that my parents instilled on me and that my Christian faith guides me by. But there were times when I would suggest to him, here's why I don't think a particular strategy may be the smartest. But at the end of the day, one of the things that people forget about Trump was every time somebody from the quote establishment or professional class told him something, don't do this, do this, most of the time he did what he wanted, and he had a record of saying, I was told not to do this, I did X anyway, and I came out more successful, or I won, or I defeated that person. So the problem, to be blunt, is that it's one thing to give him advice or to say, hey, I think we could be more effective doing this way, or this is going to take us off message. But Trump sort of looks at a lot of the folks in politics and said, if you guys are so smart, I'd never be elected, and I would have never done this, and I would have never been successful here and here and here. So frankly, I don't think for a lot of individuals in the political world, they've got in his mind a strong track record of being right when it comes to telling him what to do. And he takes that into consideration when he makes a decision.
Yeah. I didn't grow up around media or television, didn't get involved in it till I was 50 years old, but I learned things once I got into it. And we had a budget here for Dr. Phil where we could buy time on radio, off-air sort of promotional things. But I learned really fast the difference between earned media and purchased media. I learned if we had a really big story that resonated with the public, we could get tens of millions of dollars of earned media that there's no way we could buy that. We didn't have the budget to buy that, and it wasn't for sale like on the morning shows or a lot of the shows, even if you had the money. It seemed to me that as much as he appeared to be a loose cannon, you had someone that was driving the news cycles and creating earned media in the hundreds of millions of dollars that could have never been purchased.
He could own a narrative in 10 seconds. I mean, if he woke up and sent a tweet, regardless of whether it was an attack or a support for something, that became the story. And he knew it. He knew early on how his actions, his statements, his tweets drove media. And they still do today. I mean, the littlest things that he does, reporters and folks online are captivated by. So I think he understands how to utilize media that in a way, frankly, that I don't think any politician ever will in the future, because he's willing to engage in a very personal level in a way that I've never seen throughout my career. I mean, most of the time, as I said earlier, people are like, hey, let's craft something up and make sure that everybody's in agreement and run it by the entire staff and poll test it. Trump, it's all gut. And I think when you, as I said earlier, you can disagree with the style and sometimes the substance, but he has a track record of showing when he does it his way, he ends up getting what he wants. Whether or not that's what everyone agrees is the greater good is up for debate sometimes, depending on how he's going after someone. But I think the broader point is that he understands how to utilize media in a way that I don't think I've seen anybody harness.
Well, I guess the people that criticized him the most fed the monster the most, because if he would say something that was just outrageous in attacking someone, their character, getting personal, going outside the lines, and he certainly colored outside the lines, they were the ones that would throw gas on the fire, which made it work. And he seemed to understand that.
Yeah, and he still does. And that's, I mean, it's not, I think his background in media and in New York politics, in New York real estate, and then obviously with NBC and such, he understood what makes a good story and how to make something go viral and get attention. And so he's used that in politics in a way that, as I said, I've never seen anybody do on that kind of level.